Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling what I think is, well, it's the ultimate historical detective story. How do we actually build the history of ancient India when half the evidence is still buried, unreadable, or, maybe even intentionally misleading?
Precisely. Our listener, the learner, has given us this massive, intellectually thrilling challenge. We are not just reciting names and dates, we are performing methodological surgery. This deep dive is about understanding the sources, the rules of evidence, and the necessary hierarchy historians must impose when reconstructing history. A history often pieced together from everything from pottery shards to philosophical poetry.
And the big picture challenge here is truly monumental. We are dealing with a world that didn't leave neat, comprehensive chronicles. We have to quickly grasp the full spectrum of evidence, material remains, the economic signal of coins, the permanence of inscriptions, the sprawling volume of literary text, and the crucial insights from natural sciences.
The initial problem is this. Ancient India certainly knew how to write. The Harappan, or Indus culture, flourishing in the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, left behind inscriptions, but those writings remain an undeciphered pictographic script.
So they were literate, but were deaf to what they were saying.
Completely deaf. This means that for a massive initial period proto-history where writing existed, we can't hear the voices of the people.
That one fact dictates everything that follows, doesn't it? Decipherable writing only appears reliably centuries later, in the 3rd century BC, with the famous Ashokan inscriptions.
Exactly. Before Ashoka, we have a vast silence. This reality forces a massive reliance on non-written, material evidence for reconstructing the earliest and arguably the most foundational phases of the subcontinent's history.
So, our mission is to cover the spectrum. How physical remnants are dated using C14 science, the trade secrets hidden in currency, the definitive records set in stone, the philosophy embedded in epic poetry, and crucially, how modern scientific archaeology is forcing historians to fundamentally reconsider traditional text-based timelines. You are about to become a detective of deep time.
Let's start literally from the ground up, with the material past. When historians talk about the evidence recovered by archaeology, we separate the world into 2 essential categories: prehistory and proto-history, based on the availability of, well, readable written sources.
Okay, define that boundary line for us. What's the real difference?
Prehistory is the period with absolutely no written sources at all. The evidence we have is purely physical: fossils, human, plant, animal, and of course stone tools. These finds are generally recovered from hill slopes and riverbanks, stretching back over 98% of the total time scale of history.
98%, wow.
Yeah.
And proto-history.
Proto-history is where the challenge, the real puzzle, begins. Writing was known, but it is yet undeciphered. The Harappan or Indus culture is the textbook example here, flourishing in the middle of the 3rd millennium BC. It's also important to note that the Chalcolithic or Copper Stone Age cultures also fall into this category, not because their writing is undeciphered, but because they simply lacked writing altogether. They are defined solely by their material culture.
That makes the work of archaeology incredibly critical then. I mean, it's our only window for reconstructing social and cultural history across the subcontinent, particularly for everything predating the Maurya Empire.
Absolutely. The surviving stone monuments are wonderful, of course, but the majority of ancient remains, the day-to-day life, the structures of the common people lies buried in what we call mounds.
Mounds. Explain what that means in an archaeological sense.
A mound is simply an elevated portion of land covering the remains of old habitations built up over successive centuries of human occupation. They are, stratified archives, the keys to the material past.
So the layers of soil literally tell a chronological story. And I'm guessing not all these layered archives are equally useful for historical reconstruction.
Correct. We define 3 types based on the cultures they represent. The simplest is the single culture mound. This represents only one culture throughout, perhaps the painted grayware, or PGW, which is that distinct gray pottery associated with the early Iron Age settlements in the Gangetic Basin. Or maybe the site belongs only to the Sadhavasana culture, which dominated the Deccan.
Okay, that's straightforward. Then you have the major culture mound, where one culture is dominant, but others are secondary or peripheral.
And finally, the multiculture mound. This is where things get truly essential for historians trying to link material reality back to literary tradition. These mounds represent several important cultures succeeding one another, sometimes even with overlapping periods.
So when you excavate those properly, you can see the sequence.
You see the precise chronological sequence of settlements and material life. If you want to understand the successive layers of social evolution and material culture referenced in vast texts like the Ramayana and Mahabharata texts that were compiled over a millennium, you have to look at these multicultural mounds to see that sequence materialize beneath the ground.
It's the physical proof that lets you question the timeline in the texts themselves.
Precisely. And as we'll see, that is a crucial methodological step.
Okay, so once a mound is identified, how do archaeologists even begin to manage the complex process of digging to figure out those sequences? I know there are two main techniques, vertical and horizontal excavation.
Yes, and they serve very different purposes. Vertical excavation means lengthwise digging, generally confined to a relatively small part of the site. Its goal is strictly chronological. It uncovers the period-wise sequence of cultures.
So it's like taking a core sample.
A perfect analogy. This method is common because it provides the essential chronological backbone of material culture in an efficient way. It tells us that culture A came before culture B, which came before culture C.
But if they only dig a narrow trench, they're missing the whole picture of the community at any one time, right? You're getting a slice, not the whole cake.
That's the major limitation. The alternative is horizontal excavation, which means digging the mound as a whole, or at least a major representative part of it. This method enables the excavator to obtain a complete idea of the culture in a particular period.
So not just what came first, but how the whole town was laid out.
Exactly. The full structure of the community, the economy, the spatial relationships, everything.
I understand horizontal digging is pretty rare, though.
Yeah.
What are the implications of that economic constraint? I mean, why is it so rare?
It's extremely expensive and can require decades of work, which is why they are so rare globally, not just in India. And the implication is fundamental. We have an incomplete picture of material life in many phases of ancient Indian history. We know the chronological sequence from the more common vertical digs, but we often lack the fully fleshed out, three-dimensional social and urban blueprint of ancient life at any one time.
So our knowledge of ancient urban planning, domestic life, communal structure, it's all structurally fragmented because of this cost barrier.
It is, and this fragmentation is compounded by something else. The varying nature of preservation across the subcontinent, which is a key factor dictated by geography.
Right, climate.
It's a crucial geological factor that historians must always keep in mind. In the dry, arid climate of western Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, and northwestern India, antiquities are found in an excellent state of preservation. Think textiles, wood, even unbaked clay structures can sometimes survive for millennia.
But what about the heartland, the major river valleys where so much happened?
If you move to the moist and humid climate of the mid-Gangetic plains or the deltaic regions of the east and south, preservation is, well, it's poor. The climate is hostile to organic materials and metals. Even iron implements, which were the defining technology of the Iron Age, suffered severe corrosion, sometimes leaving behind only rust traces.
So all you're left with is stone or fired brick.
Exactly. Mud structures often become difficult to detect and differentiate from natural earth. In these regions, only objects made of burnt brick or stone survive well, meaning our archaeological window is inherently biased toward the durable, non-organic, and often, the wealthier side of society.
That structural bias is a powerful reminder that history is always constructed from what survived, not necessarily what was most common. This brings us to the science, the incredible precision that moves archaeology out of informed speculation and into hard chronological data. We are talking about dating the dead, specifically radiocarbon dating or C14.
This is where physics meets history. C14 is a naturally occurring radioactive isotope present in all living objects. While the object, a tree, an animal, a human is alive, the decay of C14 is constantly neutralized by absorption through air and food. It maintains a constant level.
And what happens when life stops?
When the object dies, absorption stops instantly, and the C14 begins to decay at a uniform, measurable, exponential rate. This uniform rate is the key to providing an absolute date.
What is that magic number, the half-life?
The half-life of C14 is 5,568 years. That is the precise period during which half the radioactive content in the object disappears. We measure the residual C14 against the expected original amount.
Give us a quick calculation to lock that concept down for us.
Certainly. If an object ceased to live 5,568 years ago, its C14 content would be exactly half. If it died 11,136 years ago, 2 half-lives, its C14 content would be precisely 1/4 of what it was when it was living. By measuring that loss through a highly sensitive spectrometer, we determine the age. It's remarkably reliable.
It is, but it's not limitless, is it?
No, not at all. C14 dating cannot date antiquity older than approximately 70,000 years, due to the minimal residual radioactivity left. But for the periods we're discussing in ancient Indian history, C14 is absolutely invaluable for grounding the material culture in absolute time.
And we don't stop there. The total study of the past, especially prehistory, requires a full integration of natural sciences. You made the powerful point earlier that natural sciences underpin the study of over 98% of the total timescale of history.
We have to bring in geology, biology, and chemistry. Take pollen analysis, for example. This involves the scientific examination of plant residues, specifically microfragments of pollen embedded in soil strata. The results help us determine climate and vegetation patterns across millennia.
So we can look at the pollen record and essentially see how the landscape and climate changed, which then dictated human settlement and agriculture.
Precisely. Pollen analysis suggests, for example, that early forms of agriculture were already being practiced in regions like Rajasthan and Kashmir around 7,000, 6,000 BC.
Wow, that pushes back the timeline for organized cultivation far earlier than anyone would have thought based on just texts alone.
Far earlier. Then there's the material culture of technology. That's where metal analysis comes in. Scientific analysis of metal artifacts, their chemical composition, trace impurities, allows us to locate the source mines from which the copper, tin, or iron was extracted. This is crucial for identifying stages in the development of metal technology over time. Was it crude smelting or refined alloying?
And tracing the metal source also implies trade routes and resource access between different communities, I'd imagine.
Absolutely. The chemical fingerprinting of metal objects maps out ancient economic highways. Complementing this are biological studies. Examination of animal bones found in archaeological sites helps us determine whether animals were domesticated, and also indicates the specific uses to which they were put by ancient communities, whether for farming, transport, or food.
And finally, the context itself, the ground they lived on.
Geological studies are non-negotiable. They provide the history of the soil and rocks, which is necessary for a total study of prehistory. Human history cannot be understood in isolation. It is a continuing interaction between humans and their soils, their plants, their animals, and the underlying geology. When constructing ancient India, you have to start with the natural environment.
Moving from the soil archive to the economic archive, let's talk about coins. The study of numismatics provides a tangible, dated link to both economic activity and political authority that inscriptions sometimes miss.
What's fascinating here is how this archive reveals technological capabilities. Ancient Indian currency was strictly metal copper, silver, gold, and lead-not paper. We even find coin molds made of burnt clay discovered in large numbers, mostly relating to the Kushan period in the first 3 Christian centuries. This tells us they were mass-producing coinage.
And the use of these production molds almost completely disappeared after the Guptas, suggesting a major economic shift.
It does. It suggests a centralization shift, or perhaps a decline in the large-scale production required by booming trade. And because ancient India lacked a modern, centralized banking system, people stored their wealth in physical hoards.
Which were literally buried in the ground.
Yes, often in earthenware or brass vessels. These hoards are incredible time capsules. Many contain not only Indian coins, but also foreign coins, such as those minted in the Roman Empire. The discovery of Roman hoards in different parts of India, especially the south, confirms extensive and robust foreign trade routes that reached from the Mediterranean all the way to the Indian Ocean ports.
So the economic story of global connectivity is right there in the middle. But how do coins help us reconstruct the political history of specific dynasties when the texts are silent?
Crucially, the areas where specific coin types are found indicate their primary circulation region, and by extension, the extent of the issuing dynasty's authority. This was absolutely crucial for reconstructing the history of several ruling dynasties, especially the Indo-Greeks in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC.
The Indo-Greeks.
Yes, ruling parts of North Afghanistan and Pakistan. They're almost entirely known to us through their coin evidence. Without their distinctive coinage, their history would be far more obscure, a fact that powerfully elevates numismatics above less tangible records.
And what about non-royal currency? That must signal a decentralized economy.
Absolutely. Coins issued by guilds of merchants and goldsmiths, sometimes with the permission of rulers, indicate flourishing crafts and commerce and the growing autonomy and importance of mercantile classes in the economy. This shows that economic power was not always solely concentrated in the hands of the king.
And the sheer volume of coins found tells an economic tale too, the ebb and flow of national wealth.
No question. The largest number of Indian coins date to the post-Maurya period made of various materials. Crucially, the Guptas issued the largest number of gold coins in the ancient period. This proliferation signals stability, large-scale commerce, and prosperity during the post-Maurya and much of the Gupta era.
And the inverse is also true. Fewer coins means a weaker economy.
Precisely. The few coins found belonging to the post-Gupta period indicate a clear decline of trade and commerce and a fragmentation of the economic landscape in that era. The volume is a direct indicator of economic health. We also observe a shift towards low purchasing power powries being used as currency, which appear in substantial numbers in post-Gupta times, reinforcing the idea of an increasingly localized and less affluent economy where larger, valuable coinage was rare.
Beyond the economy, they provide cultural and religious clues, you said.
Indeed. Coins portray kings. They often include inscriptions with dynastic titles, they depict divinities, and they utilize religious symbols. They are miniature historical billboards, throwing light on the art, the language, and the prevailing religious ideologies of the time in a very compact, dated package.
Okay, so if coins provide snapshots of the economy and art, inscriptions provide detailed, durable political and social records. You mentioned they're far more important than coins. Why is that?
It's due to their permanence and the sheer depth of detail they can convey. The field is called epigraphy, and the study of the old writing used in those records is paleography.
And the genius of an inscription is that it was intentionally a document set in stone or metal to last forever.
That's the key difference from a perishable manuscript. Inscriptions were carved on seals, stone pillars, the earliest durable material, rocks, temple walls, and importantly, copper plates. Stone pillars and rocks ensured widespread visibility.
And the use of copper plate seems particularly significant for historians, especially as we move into the early centuries AD.
Copper plates became the preferred medium for records of land grants and transactions, which are invaluable for understanding agrarian history. And in South India, the practice of engraving inscriptions directly onto temple walls continued on a massive scale, serving as permanent records of everything from donations to local administration. You simply don't have the same level of loss or decay with these mediums that you have with organic materials like palm leaves or birch bark.
Let's look at the evolution of the script itself, because that also traces the spread of political and cultural influence across the subcontinent.
The earliest deciphered inscriptions, the ones we can actually read, are the Ashokan inscriptions from the 3rd century BC. They were predominantly written in the Brahmi script, which ran from left to right, and in the Prakrit language, which was the common tongue.
But not everywhere.
Not everywhere, no. In the northwestern part, we find the Khrashti script, written from right to left. And in Pakistan and Afghanistan, Ashoka utilized Greek and Aramaic scripts for local populations.
So Ashoka was multilingual in his governance, but Brahmi dominates the script landscape for centuries.
Yes, Brahmi was the main script until the end of Gupta times. Later, regional variations started to appear, which eventually evolved into modern Devanagari and other South Asian scripts. Language-wise, Sanskrit was adopted as an epigraphic medium in the 2nd century AD, becoming widespread in the 4th and 5th centuries, coinciding with the rise of the Guptas. Regional languages only started appearing epigraphically much later, in the 9th and 10th centuries.
Here is the truly incredible human story. The decipherment itself. We mentioned the Harappan script remains a mystery, but the breakthrough for reading the Ashokan inscriptions is one of the greatest aha moments in historical research.
It is the defining moment that shifted ancient Indian history from a mythological tradition to a measurable chronological sequence. Ashokan pillars were discovered centuries ago. Feroz Shah Tulak in the 14th century found 2 pillars, but his scholars failed completely to decipher them.
And the mystery persisted well into the British colonial period.
The breakthrough finally came in 1837 when James Prinsep, a civil servant of the East India Company in Bengal, successfully deciphered these ancient epigraphs. Prinsep didn't just read an ancient language, he unlocked centuries of silence. Critically, this decipherment led to the identification of the figure Piyadasi, beloved of the gods, in the inscriptions as the Emperor Ashoka.
And this directly ties into the chronological anchor provided by the Greeks, right? That's the linchpin.
Precisely. Once Ashoka was identified, historians could align the Greek references to Chandragupta Maurya's Chandrakotos with the Indian timeline. Since the Greeks gave a fixed date for Chandragupta's accession, 322 BC, and Ashoka was his grandson, That single act of decipherment by Prinsep provided the fixed chronological reference point, the sheet anchor, needed to date all other floating Puranic traditions and textual sources. Without Prinsep, we would still be largely lost in a sea of mythic time.
It's amazing. Now that we can read them, what are the different types of stories these inscriptions tell us, beyond just political fact?
We have four crucial categories. First, royal orders, such as the Ashokan edicts, which convey decisions on social, religious, and administrative matters. Ashoka used them to disseminate his policy of Dhamma across his empire. They provide a direct look into the governance and morality advocated by the central power.
Second, the devotional records.
The votive records, marks of devotion for various faiths, Buddhism, Jainism, Vaishnavism found on stupas, pillars, or images. These records are invaluable for tracing the rise and geographical spread of different religious movements. Third, we have the ancient press releases, eulogies or prashastis.
Glorifying the kings.
Yeah.
Basically propaganda.
Exactly. These texts, like the famous Allahabad pillar inscription of Samudrikta, glorify the attributes and military achievements of kings and conquerors. They are magnificent historical documents, but we must read them critically. They are inherently biased, intentionally ignoring the king's defeats, weaknesses, or internal rebellions.
But perhaps the most crucial category for understanding the actual mechanics of ancient society are the donative records. This is the real insight into economics and power.
Absolutely. Donative records refer to gifts of cattle, land revenues, or entire villages. They are frequently engraved on copper plates, making them easily transportable and extremely permanent. These gifts, made by kings, princes, artisans, and merchants, are invaluable for socioeconomic study.
So why are these copperplate grants more important than a royal eulogy?
Because they reveal the rise of new states and fundamental changes in the social and agrarian structure. They don't just tell us who the king was, they tell us who owned the land, who collected the taxes, and how decentralized real power had become. These donative records are the true primary source for understanding the radical decentralization of power and the rise of, well, a feudal-like system in the post-Gupta era, a shift that eulogies would never openly address.
Let's transition now from the permanence of stone and metal to the vast layered world of indigenous literary sources. While inscriptions offer a fixed chronology, literature provides the philosophy, narrative, and, I guess, the cultural context.
That's right. But we immediately run into a preservation problem here because of the tropical climate.
Right. Things just don't last.
Exactly. Manuscript preservation in ancient India is a challenge. Our most ancient surviving manuscripts, written on organic materials like birch bark and palm leaves, are generally not older than the 84th century. And many of the oldest were found not in India itself, but in the drier climate of Central Asia, having been carried there by pilgrims and traders.
The spiritual bedrock of this literary tradition is the Vedic corpus. How do historians date these incredibly complex texts? They seem to float in time.
They are layered and notoriously difficult to pin down to a specific year. The Rig Veda, which mainly comprises prayers, is generally assigned to roughly 1500–1000 BC, representing the earliest phase of Indo-Aryan culture. The later texts like the Yajur Veda, Atharva Veda, the explanatory Brahmanas, and the philosophical Upanishads date roughly to 1500 BC. They comprise rituals, magic, mythology, and profound philosophical speculation.
And the critical challenge with all these Vedic texts is the risk of interpolation, right? They were updated over time.
Indeed. They are not pristine. Interpolation's later editions designed to update laws or customs generally appear at the beginning or the end of a text, seldom in the middle. Historians must peel back these layers to find the original context, sometimes using the linguistic shift between early Vedic Sanskrit and classical Sanskrit as a guide.
To aid in that understanding, we rely heavily on the Vedangas, the necessary supplements for understanding the Vedas, such as phonetics, ritual, meter, and, crucially, grammar.
This brings us to the famous grammar of Panini. We have to ask, why is a dense technical text on grammar so invaluable to the historian?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a historical chronicle. Why is a fixed date for a book on Sanskrit rules so pivotal?
Because the grammar of Panini, written around 450 BC, is a primary source due to its antiquity and its freedom from myth and legend. Panini's purpose was to accurately catalog the Sanskrit language of his day. In doing so, he unintentionally preserved a perfect snapshot of the society, economy, and culture of the pre-Mauryan territorial states, the Janapadas.
So he mentions specific cities, professions, and social customs simply as examples of linguistic usage, essentially giving us a non-biased ethnography.
Exactly. He reveals the names of cities, the different types of currency used, the specific occupational groups, and the political structures of the time. This detail is pure, accidental historical data. Patanjali's commentary on Panini, dated 150 BC, similarly informs our understanding of post-Maurya times. These grammatical works, with their relatively fixed dates, are considered almost as reliable as dated inscriptions.
Then we have the two massive, sprawling epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, which were finally compiled around 8400. They are less fixed in time and much more layered.
The Mahabharata is considered the older and more complex. It started as Jaya, a collection dealing with victory, consisting of just 8,800 verses. It then grew to 24,000 verses, known as Bharata, and finally swelled dramatically to 100,000 verses, becoming the Mahabharata or Shatasasri Samhita.
100,000 verses, that's a library, not a single book. The scale is just mind-boggling.
It is a stratified archive of social evolution. While the main narrative relating to the Kaurava-Pandava conflict might relate to the later Vedic period, the vast didactic parts, the teachings on law, morality, and governance, often relate to the post-Maurya and Gupta periods. Historians use it to trace the evolution of social norms and political ideology over a millennium, recognizing that the text is often projecting later values onto earlier events.
The Ramayana seems less sprawling, but still complex in its layering.
It started later, possibly in the 5th century BC, originally with 6,000 verses, eventually reaching 24,000. Although it appears more unified than the Mahabharata, it also has lengthy didactic and philosophical parts that were added later. Its final stage of compilation may have been as late as the 12th century AD, showing that these narratives were living, breathing documents constantly being updated to reflect contemporary society.
Beyond the Hindu text, non-Vedic religious literature from Buddhism and Jainism provides absolutely crucial historical anchors, sometimes even more reliable for political reconstruction.
The earliest Buddhist texts were written in Pali, a form of Prakrit spoken in Magadha, and were finally compiled in writing in the 1st century BC in Sri Lanka. They are crucial because they not only discuss the life of the Buddha, but also mention some of his royal contemporaries, helping us reconstruct the political landscape of eastern UP and Bihar.
I find the Jatakas particularly revealing because they provide a ground-level view that high philosophy often ignores.
They do. The Jatakas are stories of the Buddha's 550-plus previous births, framed as folk tales, often involving him as an animal or a commoner. As non-canonical literature, they throw invaluable light on the daily social and economic conditions, trade routes, poverty, the organization of crafts, the structure of villages of the period between the 5th and 2nd centuries BC. They provide that essential window into the lives of non-elites.
And the Jaina texts, a similar story.
Similar, but with a different focus. They were written in Prakrit, but were compiled much later, in the 6th century AD, in Vallabhi, Gujarat. They are extremely useful for reconstructing the political history of eastern UP and Bihar in the age of Mahavira. Critically, Jaina tradition repeatedly references trade, traders, and mercantile activities, echoing the rise of these economically powerful communities in the Gangetic Valley.
Finally, we have secular literature outside the formal religious sphere, starting with the important law books or Dharmashastras.
These texts, including the Dharma Sutras 500 to 200 BC and the Smritis 1st 6th CAD, function as ancient legal codes. They prescribe duties for the various social classes, varnas, rules for marriage, property laws, and punishments for crimes. They reveal the legal and social codes that underpin the structure of ancient society and maintained its hierarchies.
And the famous Arthashastra of Kautilya, often seen as a sort of ancient The Prince.
It is a complex text on statecraft, put in its final form in the early Christian era, though its earliest portions clearly reflect the state of society and economy in the age of the Mauryas. It provides incredibly rich, detailed material for the study of ancient Indian polity and economy, covering everything from espionage to taxation, even if we acknowledge it was a composite work assembled by different hands over time.
And for cultural aesthetics, we have the great creative works, like those of Kalidasa.
Kalidasa's dramas and poems, such as Abhishnana Shakuntalam, besides their obvious literary value, mirror the social and cultural life of the Guptas. They give us a clear window into courtly aesthetics, the relationship between royalty and commoners, and the general social structure and leisure activities of that period, the so-called Golden Age.
While indigenous sources are rich, they are often characterized by significant chronological gaps and are, well, almost entirely silent on critical military or political events involving foreign entities. This is why foreign accounts are essential, right? They fill these crucial voids.
They absolutely do. The ultimate example of that silence, which we briefly mentioned, is Alexander's invasion in 326 DC. It finds no mention in Indian sources whatsoever.
Not a single one. That's incredible.
Not one. Its history, its route, and its impact are entirely reconstructed from Greek accounts. That gap highlights the necessity of external observers. But the single most crucial contribution of the Greek writers is providing that chronological sheet anchor we discussed earlier.
Let's detail that connection again, because it's the foundation of ancient history.
Greek writers mention a contemporary of Alexander they called Sandracatas. This figure was identified by modern scholars as Chandragupta Maurya. Because the Greeks were meticulous in their dating, they fixed his accession at 322 BC. That single, fixed, corroborated date allowed historians to align the otherwise floating chronologies of the Puranas, the epics, and the subsequent Buddhist and Jain texts. Before 322 BC, the timeline is speculation. After it, it becomes measurable.
So what are the key classical sources we rely on for the post-Alexander period?
First, the fragmented Indica of Megasthenes, who was a Greek ambassador at Chandragupta Maurya's court. While his fragments contain credulity and exaggerations, sometimes describing fantastic Indian wildlife or 7 rigid social castes, they furnish immensely valuable information on Maurya administration, social classes, and economic activities. We have to filter his biases, but the administrative details are strong.
And then the crucial sources related to sea trade.
We rely heavily on documents relating to the burgeoning global economy. The Anonymous Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, written between AD 115, and Ptolemy's Geography, AD 150, written Greek, provide invaluable data on ancient Indian geography, named ports, and the extensive trade routes connecting India to the Roman Empire via the Red Sea.
So, we have commercial proof of global connectivity, often driven by Roman demand for Indian luxury goods.
Exactly. Pliny the Elder's Latin Naturalis Historia, for C, details the volume of trade between India and Italy, often expressing Roman anxiety about the massive outflow of gold to pay for Indian silks, spices, and pepper. Later, around 550 AD, Cosmos Indicapolistes' Christian topography mentions Christian communities in India and the specific horse trade routes from the west. These sources confirm the thriving economic links between the subcontinent and the West.
And finally, we turn to the Chinese Buddhist travelers, who acted as crucial cultural and social reporters during later imperial periods.
They gave us objective, non-political snapshots. Fabienne, who came in the early 5th century, describes social, religious, and economic conditions in the age of the Guptas, focusing on the peaceful nature of the society he observed. 2 centuries later, Xuanzang, in the early 7th century, provides an incredibly detailed account of India in the age of Harsha. As religious pilgrims, they focused on details that indigenous court historians often ignored: the state of monasteries, common religious practices, charity, and general social order.
Let's move to a unique body of indigenous literature, Sangam literature, which gives us a rare, non-Sanskritic window into the early history of South India.
This literature was produced by assemblies, or sangams, of poets over several centuries, primarily in Tamil, and was finally completed by the 6th century AD. It's unique because it comprises about 30,000 lines of highly secular poetry arranged in 8 anthologies. It focuses on life and love, not primarily religion.
It sounds much more like a direct social history than the didactic epics of the North.
It is often compared to the Homeric heroic poetry of Greece. The poems are secular, praising heroes, detailing military exploits, and celebrating the generous gifts made by chiefs and kings to bards and warriors. This focus on verifiable events is key. Some of the Chera kings mentioned in the texts are corroborated by inscriptions dating to the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, lending strong historical credibility to the narratives.
And like the foreign accounts, Sangam literature confirms extensive trade, particularly with the Western world, providing an independent indigenous source for this global connectivity.
Absolutely. The texts refer to flourishing port settlements like Kavripatanam, whose existence has been archaeologically corroborated. They also speak in detail of Yavanas, a term often used for Westerners, typically Romans, coming in their own large vessels, buying pepper with large quantities of gold, and supplying luxury items like wine and women slaves to the native chiefs. This wealth of trade information, corroborated both by archaeological finds and Latin Greek writings, makes the Sangam texts a major, high-priority source for the social, economic, and political life of Deltaic Tamil Nadu in the early Christian centuries.
Okay, so with all these sources in mind, we have to talk about how we put them all together. We must directly address the persistent critique that ancient Indians, unlike the Greeks or Romans, lacked a proper sense of history.
Right. And while they certainly didn't write history in the modern sense, focusing on critical analysis, political causation, and linear narrative, that doesn't mean the sense of recording time and change was absent.
So what evidence supports the idea that they possessed a concept of time, lineage, and documentation?
We see a kind of dynastic history embedded within the Puranas, traditionally 18 in number. While encyclopedic and full of mythology, they provide dynastic lists up to the start of Gupta rule. They indicate the importance of time and place. More philosophically, the Puranas speak of 4 ages, Krita, Treta, Dvapara, and Kali, where each succeeding age sees a degeneration of moral values.
Which is a clear recognition of change over time.
It's the very essence of history, and we see that historical sense concretely recorded in the very sources we prioritize, the inscriptions. The Ashokan inscriptions in the 3rd century BC consciously record events from the 8th to the 27th regnal year. This isn't just decoration, it's documentation. Similarly, Caravella of Kalinga in the 1st century BC records a large number of events in his life year by year in the Hathigumpha inscription. That is a clear, conscious attempt to document a chronological sequence.
There's also a clear biographical tradition, the Charitas, which historians must mine carefully.
The Indians displayed a considerable historical sense in these biographical writings. The most famous is Banabhata's Harshacharita from the 7th century. It is highly ornate and flowery, focusing heavily on praise, but it details the early career of King Harshavardhana and gives an excellent idea of court, social, and religious life under his rule. It's semi-biographical, not critical history, but invaluable nonetheless.
And this tradition continued later, often capturing localized political dynamics that the major epics missed.
Yes, Santiakaranandi's Ramacharita, 12th C, recounted the conflict between the Kaivarta peasants and the Pala prince Ramapala, capturing a specific, real-world agrarian conflict, and a rare region-specific account from South India, the Mushika Vamsha, 11th C, details a dynasty in northern Kerala, showing this tradition wasn't limited to the imperial north.
But the acknowledged benchmark for ancient Indian historical writing is a specific text from the edge of the subcontinent.
That is Kahana's Rajataranjini, or the Stream of Kings, written in the 12th century, chronicling the kings of Kashmir. Kahana's work is the best example because he consulted diverse sources, questioned the reliability of traditions, and attempted to present a continuous critical political narrative. It is widely considered the first work to possess several characteristics of modern historical writing.
Before we move to the final synthesis of all these sources, we need to talk about how contemporary society can actually inform our understanding of the ancient past. The concept here is ancient survivals found in village life today, ethnography informing history.
This is a powerful, often overlooked ethnographic tool. Past practices can sometimes be understood by observing relics of communal sharing that still persist in village life, in feasts, festivals, and pujas. These relics hint at an ancient, perhaps more egalitarian, tribal society that existed before rigid stratification took hold.
And conversely, we see the survival of entrenched inequality.
We do. The persistence of intense loyalty to clan and caste, even today, reflects and illuminates ancient social structures that are explicitly described in the Dharmashastras. For instance, the contempt that high caste people often hold for manual labor, not milking cows or plowing, directly promotes untouchability and mirrors rules found in the ancient legal texts.
It's a living illustration of the ancient codes.
Exactly. The source notes that strong traces of inequality are evident not just in caste, but in the relationship between man and woman. The practice of the sati system, for example, prevailed in rural parts of Bihar until the 1930s. Rural rituals and entrenched caste prejudices today don't just exist in isolation. They serve to illustrate, in concrete terms, many of the rules prescribed in the ancient legal texts.
So, familiarity with contemporary village life and the insights derived from the study of primitive people are valuable assets for the historian, allowing them to visualize the abstract rules found in ancient texts.
Now, let's synthesize everything and discuss the necessary shift in historical methodology. Historically, ancient history has been constructed principally using literary sources, indigenous and foreign, with coins and inscriptions often playing a secondary illustrative role.
But our entire discussion, especially regarding dating, makes a very strong case for inverting that hierarchy. We must prioritize the material evidence.
Absolutely. The results of prehistoric, proto-historic, and historical archaeology must be fully integrated into the mainstream narrative, forcing us to move beyond solely highlighting religious or political history to fully incorporate social and economic trends revealed by material culture. The The required shift is clear and non-negotiable. On chronological and rational grounds, archaeology, inscriptions, and coins are more important than traditional texts.
That is a fundamental methodological statement, putting the physical, datable object above the tradition-based narrative. I know the source gives one major exception to that rule regarding texts.
That is the grammatical works, specifically Panini and Patanjali. Since they have almost fixed dates and are comparatively free from myth, legend, and interpolation, they are considered as important and as primary as the fixed date material evidence like inscriptions.
This shift is crucial because relying too heavily on texts leads to major chronological contradictions and what we now know are incorrect historical timelines. Let's dedicate some serious detail to challenging traditional dates. This is the ultimate aha takeaway for the listener.
We start with the epics. Puranic tradition suggests dating Rama of Ayodhya to around 2000 BC. However, extensive excavations in Ayodhya show no settled life around that date. Settlement begins centuries later. Similarly, while Krishna is a central figure in the Mahabharata, the earliest inscriptions and sculptural pieces from Mathura between 200 BC and 8300 do not attest to his presence in the divine or historical role described in the epic.
The implication is profound. We must discard the romanticized idea of a single epic age. The epics reflect not one fixed historical period, but multiple stages of social evolution over time.
And this chronological conflict extends directly to the foundational figures of two major world religions. Mahavira and the Buddha are traditionally dated to the 6th century BC, based entirely on religious literary traditions. But when historians apply archaeological investigation to the major cities they are said to have visited, like Vaishali, Rajagriha, and Shravasti, these settlements are not archaeologically older than 400 BC.
So, if the cities didn't fully exist when the founders were supposedly visiting them, we have a 2-century mismatch. This forces a reconsideration of the entire scaffolding of 6th century BC India.
It does. It requires historians to critically reevaluate the traditional dates of these figures and, by extension, the entire chronology of the early territorial states, Mahajanapadas of the Gangetic Valley. The hard evidence of the ground must override the tradition-based dates.
We must also be critical of the textual and inscriptional content itself, acknowledging inherent exaggerations, even in sources we generally trust.
Yes, even reliable inscriptions contain embellishment. For instance, the term hundreds of thousands seems to be a cliché in Ashokan inscriptions, applied to the number of people killed in the Kalinga War. Samudragupta's eulogies are also highly inflated by definition. But despite these exaggerations, inscriptions are far more reliable than generalized Puranic traditions. For example, inscriptions date the Satavahanas to the 1st century BC, consistently contradicting Puranic attempts to push the dynasty's date back hundreds of years earlier.
The ultimate goal, then, isn't just to reconstruct the political lineage of kings, but to use these primary sources to reveal underlying social, economic, and agrarian trends.
Precisely. We value epigraphic land grants not just for confirming the family trees of the kings who issued them, but primarily for what they tell us about the rise of the landowning class, the fundamental changes in the social and agrarian structure, and the decentralization of state power, especially in post-Gupta times. Similarly, coins are used not just to reconstruct the history of dynasties, but for the history of trade and urban life. We look for the patterns, not just the pronouncements.
Okay, to wrap this all up, a sound historical reconstruction demands a careful collection and critical evaluation of all these materials: texts, coins, inscriptions, archaeology, and natural sciences.
And this requires critical thinking to consciously separate the cultural myth from the historical event. Indeed, mythologies are crucial for understanding culture. They validate social norms and often justify caste privileges and disabilities, but the events described in them cannot be taken as historically true without corroboration. We use myths to understand belief, not politics.
Finally, we must look outward, placing ancient Indian history in a global context. We should avoid the trap of intellectual isolation.
Comparative history is essential to remove the obsession with the rare or unique in ancient India. We should be highlighting trends in the use of iron, the rise of urbanization, the emergence of currency, the development of legal codes that are shared with other ancient societies. Furthermore, the future of historical research lies in leveraging modern science further. We must use the results of human genetic research, for example, to learn about ethnic mixture, population dispersal, and the dissemination of culture across the globe, providing a new layer of objective scientific data to inform and challenge our traditional narratives.
This deep dive has shown us that constructing ancient India is a dynamic, complex, and ongoing process, not a settled one.
We've established that ancient Indian history is not a single neat narrative, but a synthesis of hard, dated evidence, archaeology, epigraphy, numismatics, and complex, layered texts, epics, Puranas, and law books. It's the constant challenge of balancing cultural belief with chronological evidence.
The value of criticality is paramount here. When sources conflict, when a buried mound says 400 BC and an ancient text compiled 1,000 years later says 600 BC, we must privilege the more chronologically fixed and rational sources like archaeological findings and dated inscriptions. They are the objective facts that ground the entire narrative. So here is our final provocative thought for you, the learner, to mull over. You now hold the core tools of the ancient historian. If archaeology demonstrates that the major cities visited by foundational figures like the Buddha and Mahavira are actually 2 centuries younger than their traditionally accepted dates, what fundamental assumptions about the entire political and social timeline of 6th century BC India assumptions that underpin the birth of 2 major world religions must we be prepared to throw out, and what does that necessary chronological shift mean for how we understand the origins of global faith?
The ground never lies, but the stories we tell about it are constantly being rewritten.
That's a wrap on this deep dive.